Good evening, and welcome back to another study in the Word. My name is Bruce Logan, and appreciate all of you who may be joining us as we begin to explore Lesson 10 of our ongoing study that we've called God's Big Story of the Bible. And for those of you who may be just joining us for the first time, I'll highly recommend that you go back and maybe take a gander at some of our previous studies, the previous 9 lessons, in order to get caught up to where we actually are right now. But for those of you, I will, in fact, do a brief study, I want to say a brief overview. And if you give me a moment to pull my slides up here. Yes, I'll just do a brief overview of where we're at. I won't go into long detail like I've done in the past, but I highly recommend that you go back and just kind of take a look at some of our previous lessons in order to kind of get up to speed to where we're actually at in this particular study. This is what I honestly believe this is a very, very important study, because it will help us to understand the whole Bible as a whole. In other words, what I mean by that is that the Bible, as contrary to what many believe, is just so much more than just a random or a collection of isolated inspirational stories and characters, which there are. The Bible is full of those that we get a lot of inspiration from, and rightfully so. It was God's intent. But the Bible is so much more than that. The Bible is literally actually just one book that tells one big systematic story, and that story is the story of redemption. Just to kind of give you an idea of what we're talking about, is that at the beginning, when Adam and Eve fell in the garden, God had a decision to make at that point in time. He could have chose to wipe Adam out, kill him and Eve off, and start all over from scratch. But God chose not to do that. God chose instead to implement a plan of redemption and restoration that would eventually, throughout the course of time, bring humanity back into right relationship, or that right fellowship that God had intended for man in the first place. And so that the Bible itself is 66 books, but it tells one story, and that story is the story of how God brought about the redemption of humanity through the line of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, who eventually gave birth to the Messiah. And that Messiah came and redeemed humanity, but that was only part of the story. The rest of the story is yet to be told at some point in the future, when that Messiah will come back again and establish his kingdom here on earth. And so that is when we refer to the big story of the Bible, this is kind of in a nutshell what we're talking about. And so in this particular study, what we're doing is we're dividing it up into 2 parts. We're going to be telling the big story of the Old Testament. And then when we conclude with that, we're going to do the same thing with that, and we're going to call it the big story of the New Testament. In other words, what we're going to be doing, and what we have been doing, is doing a survey, an overview of what the Bible is, or the big story of the Bible. It's kind of like, as I talked about earlier, like when you put together a puzzle. If you ever put together a puzzle, which was something that I was very fond of doing when I was a kid, the first thing that you had to do in order to put a puzzle together, you would dump the puzzle pieces out on the table, but then in order to be able to assemble the pieces into their proper places, there's one thing that you had to have that was absolutely essential, and that was you needed to be able to see the big picture on the box in order to then understand how the other smaller pieces fit in order to form that big picture. And so basically, in a nutshell, this is the approach that we're taking in this particular study. And as we've been pursuing through the big picture of the Old Testament, we've been exploring the Old Testament through what we call 11 Old Testament foundational books. And just for the benefit of those, just real quickly, who just may be joining this study for the very first time, as many of you, if you've studied the Bible at any length of time, you know that the canon, or the arrangement, or the order of, or the sequence of books in our Old Testament canon are not arranged in chronological order. However, there are 11 foundational books, or 11 books that are in chronological order, that give us the big picture of the Old Testament. And these 11 books are Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Joshua, Judges, First Samuel, Second Samuel, First Kings, Second Kings, Ezra, and Nehemiah. And for those of you who have been joining us for the first time, I highly recommend that you bring these 11 books to memory, because it's going to, as you're going to see, as you track with us as we go through the study, you're going to see that it's going to elevate your understanding of the Old Testament to another level. Now, these 11 books give us the historical and chronological big picture storyline, or the big picture framework of the Old Testament, and all the other 28 books of the Old Testament in some way, shape, or form, either directly or indirectly, supplement one or more of these 11 foundational books. And we're going to see an example of that here in the next couple of weeks. We're going to see just a clear example of that. So I've been showing and sharing this graph, or this particular chart, and this particular chart I really love, because it actually gives us a clear, in a single snapshot, of an overview of what we mean about how the other 28 books of the Old Testament supplement one of these 11 foundational books. In other words, the other 28 books happened during the time frame of one of these 11 foundational books. And as you can see from this chart, you can see the connection there. So by understanding the 11 foundational books and the historical framework of these 11 foundational books, then when you go back to understand any one of the supplemental books, you're going to have a much better understanding, because you'll have an understanding of the historical framework of one of these 11 foundational books, or one of the 28 supplemental books. So that's, in a nutshell, that's kind of, and I'm talking fast because I'm trying to get through, because we went over this in times, but I like to do it for the benefit of those who joined us for the first time. But I highly recommend, like I said before, that you go back and just check out some of the previous studies that we've done that are archived on my website, or on my Facebook page, or my YouTube channel, that you'll be able to search and find. So now, moving forward, what we've been doing, and as it relates to this big picture. Okay, the big picture, keep in mind that the big picture of the Bible is that God is putting together, or he's implementing a plan that's going to eventually redeem and restore humanity, and bring us back into the right relationship and the right fellowship that he originally intended when he created us in the first place, prior to the fall. So that's the big picture of what we're referring to see. How do we get from the fall to the final resurrection? Basically, in a nutshell, represents what we refer to as the big story of the Bible. So now, it all began that with the Abrahamic covenant. Well, actually, prior to the Abrahamic covenant, right at the fall, Genesis 3:15, God made his first messianic promise, or gave the first messianic prophecy, in which he prophesied that there was going to come a time that the seed of the woman, the seed of Eve, was going to bruise the serpent's head. In other words, that was the very first messianic prophecy that was eventually prophesied, that there was going to be a savior who God was going to send in order to redeem humanity back to God. Now, fast forward to Genesis chapter 12 with the giving of the Abrahamic covenant. It is here at the giving of the Abrahamic covenant, Genesis chapter 12, where God began the process of implementing the fulfillment of what he said or the promise that he made in Genesis 3:15. So hopefully that makes sense. And let's take a look again, just by way of review of the Abrahamic covenant. And so we can track along to see exactly what God is actually doing. Now notice this, and just as Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. And this is just like the opening of the Abrahamic covenant, and numerous times throughout the book of Genesis and through the life of Abraham, through the life of Isaac and Jacob, God ratified or reaffirmed this covenant and actually added additional details of the covenant. And you can just go back and look at some of our previous studies, and you'll kind of get an idea about that. Now, verse 1 in Genesis chapter 12 says, "Now the Lord had said unto Abram, get out of your country and from your kindred and from your father's house unto a land that," and I want you to notice all these "I wills," because it's very important. Because this is God speaking to Abraham. He said, "I will show you to a land that I will show you." Notice that. Notice the term "unto a land that I will show you." And then it says, "I will make of you a great nation." And by the way, let me just stick a pin there right quick. When it says there, "the land that I will show you," that's going to be very significant of the narrative going forward. So it's important to not just brush by that. It says, "and I will make of you a great nation." Another key element, or a key component to this great Abrahamic covenant. He says, "I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing." But one of the things, again, let me stick a pin there again, real quick. Notice again that Abraham is promised that he was a great nation was going to come from his generation, from his seed. But he's elderly, and his wife is barren. And they're both elderly, by the way. And so what God literally is saying here, that I am going to, from scratch, create a nation from Abraham, even though he's elderly. In other words, it's going to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt to Abraham and to all his descendants that it was God that did this. And so that's another important point to keep in mind. And in other words, God was actually supernaturally operating and orchestrating human events in order to bring to pass the promise that he made in Genesis 3:15, as well as the promise that he's making to Abraham here in Genesis chapter 12. And he says that "I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing." And then he says again in verse 3, "And I will bless them that bless you, and curse him that curse you, and in you shall all the families of the earth be blessed." Now, the key component there, the key term there, the key verse there, where God says, "I will make of you a great nation." And remember, we said that God had to create and make and form a nation that would eventually birth the Messiah, but he had to form this nation from scratch, from two elderly people who had no children, who Abraham, and whose wife was barren. And so that's kind of the background. So he says, "I will make of you a great nation." Now, in order to form a nation, there has to be three essential building blocks in order to have a nation, especially a great nation. So now notice this. This is really, really important that you grasp this, because this is a major part of the big picture narrative that we're trying to unpack. Now, in order to have a great nation, you need these three building blocks. First of all, you have to have people. And at the point where Abraham has received this Abrahamic covenant, obviously it's just him and his wife. So obviously, I mean, that's not even remotely a nation. So God had to create the nation from scratch. So he had to create and form a people from scratch. And as we learned in the previous lessons, the big story of the patriarchs, that's where that came into play. The big story of the patriarchs of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, that the famous stories that we really love, that we learned back in Sunday school. God was doing more than just those isolated stories, even though that was all a part of the narrative. But God was literally in the process of forming a nation, and through the patriarchs. So in other words, it could be said then that the big story of the patriarchs is God forming the first building block in order to form a nation, or creating or developing the first building block in order to form a nation. And that is by peopling, which is a term that I kind of like, by peopling the nation. In other words, so through the seed of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and of course with what happened with Joseph, the events surrounding the life of Joseph, God had established a baseline of people in order to proceed forward, in order to form this great nation, in order to fulfill the promise that he made to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12. So you have to have people, but then you have to have something else. You have to have more than people. You have to have a law code, which is going to be the key component of what we're going to be talking about in today's lesson, and for the next probably 2 or 3 more lessons after today. And then after you have a law or a constitution, because if you just got people and you don't have a law or constitution, basically you just have a lot of people and you just have anarchy. So you're not officially a nation. And this goes contrary to some scholars, some very famous scholars. They argue that while they're in Egypt, they were a nation, where technically they're not a nation, not in the technical sense. They don't become a nation until after they have the third building block. And that third building block is you have to have land. So you had the people that came through the patriarchs, and then the law that was given by Moses or through Moses, and then later Joshua is going to be commissioned to conquer the land. And once they conquer the land, Joshua divides the land up by tribe, and then he has a great meeting with each of the 12 tribes, and then he dismisses them to their own inheritance. And at that point, now they have become officially a nation, and that will be in Joshua chapter 24. So now, this period is what we refer to as the formation period, or the period of formation. In other words, where God is literally forming a nation. And this formation period is in the first 4 foundational books, is all about this formation period of Genesis, Exodus, which is where we're going to be here in a moment today. We're going to be beginning to unpack Exodus, and for the next couple of weeks, then Numbers, and then the book of Joshua. All right. Now, these are the very first 4. If you remember the 11 foundational books, the first 4 of the foundational books is what we refer to as the period of formation. The period of formation. In other words, that's very important to keep in mind, to understand the providential narrative that's taking place, because God is literally forming a nation, and he began to form that nation from scratch. And as we proceed through the course of time, God is adding various layers in order to bring the Abrahamic covenant into fulfillment. So we have this period of formation that encompasses the first 4 foundational books of Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, and Joshua. Now we've unpacked and we've gone through and we've dealt with the first foundational book of Exodus. So now what we want to do is we want to begin to explore the second foundational the second foundational book of the book of Exodus, which gives us the second building block that you must have in order to form a nation, and that is the people are given the law. The people, which is the first building block, are given the law or their constitution, which is what the book of Exodus is largely about. But one of the things we're going to uncover, or discover rather, is that in the book of Exodus, there's so much more than just God delivering his people, but there's so much theological richness and typology in the book of Exodus, which is the reason why I'm going to take 2 or 3 weeks in order to unpack some things, because there's so much typology. There's so many references to the New Testament. As a matter of fact, it could be argued that the book of Exodus is the richest in terms of theological richness of all the Old Testament books, from from a theological standpoint, from a Christological standpoint. Some even would make the case that the book of Exodus is the book of Romans of the Old Testament. So I mean, it's just, and you'll see why that's said, often as we go through, because we're going to point some things out that when you just consider just the basis or the basic overview of the book, you miss a lot of the theological richness. And so that's going to be what we're going to try to unpack here in the next few weeks as it pertains to the book of Exodus. Now, let's just take a brief look here at a summary of the book of Exodus. First of all, the book of Exodus can be divided into two sections that we can look at and encompass the book of Exodus. The first is chapters 1 through 18, which is a narrative. In other words, what's happening is a narration of what God did on the behalf of the Israelites as it pertains to their deliverance, is what God did. So that Moses is giving a narrative, and you got to remember too, for most of it, Moses was an eyewitness. He's giving an eyewitness testimony, so to speak, of what God did on the behalf of the people that led to their deliverance. And then the second part of the book of Exodus is chapters 19 through 40 is legislative. In other words, the first half is narrative, but now it becomes the second half, which is sort of legislative, which is what we mean by that is what God said about how they were to live now that they were set free. Now that they were delivered from Egyptian bondage, how were they to live? Which is what we mean by legislative, which is what God was doing when he gave them the law code. So now, in this particular sequence, which is very interesting, we can see the first of many parallels between the Israelite deliverance from Egyptian bondage and the believer's deliverance from sin. One of the things that you have to note that stands out rather is that the Israelites were delivered first, and then they were given the law, which told them how God wanted them to live. Now, I want to reflect on that just for a moment, because as we track through the Old Testament history, we can see that there were consequences to the violation of God's law. And so it's very important. God was very succinct, very clear, very specific in what he expected from them after the deliverance in terms of how they were to live. That's very important. Likewise, we as believers were first delivered from sin, and then we are taught how we should live now that we are delivered. In other words, God does not expect us to live the same way that we did before we were delivered. We now have become new creatures. Old things have passed away. Behold, all things have to become new now that we've been delivered from sin. So this is one of many or numerous parallels between the Old and New Testament, that lessons that we can definitely learn from as we begin to study, as we go through the book of Exodus and begin to study and really understand the law or the law code, or the different parallels. And we're going to also see as we go through many examples and many illustrations of what we refer to in theological terms as Christology. In other words, we're going to see types and shadows of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, which pointed forward to the Lord who was to come. And so this is very exciting stuff that we're going to kind of be unpacking. So, but in this first lesson here in Exodus, what we want to do rather is just kind of do an overview, a summary of what we're going to be talking about here in the next few weeks. So now, in other words, as we would say, when we were redeemed, then we are taught how to live holy lives. That's one of the reasons why God sent Apostle Paul, while we have the epistles, because now that we are redeemed, now that we were delivered, we needed to understand some basic concepts of godly living, or how we should live holy in this present world, how we should to let our light shine, how we're supposed to take authority over our flesh and so forth, and how we're to live godly, how we are to live different from the world on this side of salvation. And this is, and as we're going to see as going forward, there are a lot of parallels there that I wanted to point that out. And I want you to keep that in mind too, as we get to the second part, especially when we talk about when God finally gives the law. So I need you to kind of keep that big picture overview, that big picture narrative in mind going forward. Now, let's look at some basics about the book of Exodus. First of all, let's look at the purpose of the writing. First of all, the word Exodus basically means a mass departure. Mass departure. And I'm going to go through this kind of quickly because I want to get through this lesson just kind of giving a basic overview, a basic summary of the book of Exodus, and then we're going to like go back starting next week. We're going to like unpack some things with some more specificity. In God's timing, the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt marked the end of the period of Egyptian bondage for Abraham's descendants. In Genesis 15 and 13, I want you to notice that this is very important, because one of the things you got to keep in mind is that God was orchestrating human events. None of these events happened by random chance. God was in control, literally orchestrating events. And Genesis 15 and 13 says, and he said unto Abram, know of a surety that thy seed shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs, and shall serve them, and they shall afflict them for 400 years. So keep this in mind. Now, he said this to Abraham prior to Abraham even having any descendants. And so in other words, he is reaffirming. Remember, I said earlier that there were instances where God is reaffirming the promise of the Abrahamic covenant to Abraham, trying to increase Abraham's faith and belief that, that I'm going to accomplish what I said I'm going to accomplish. And he lets him know that his descendants is going to be in a strange land. He didn't say specifically where, but he said that they shall be afflicted for 400 years, which, by the way, is precisely what happened. Now, it also marked the continuation of the formation period, also which was in fulfillment of God's covenant promise to Abraham, that his descendants would not only live in the promised land, but would also multiply and become a great nation. So in other words, this period of formation is all a part of the big picture of what God was doing in order to bring the Abrahamic covenant to pass. And it's important to keep in mind, because this was the process that God chose to implement in order to birth his Messiah. Birth his son as the Messiah to come and redeem humanity. So this is what God was literally doing. He was literally orchestrating human events, and he chose this man by the name of Abram. At the time, his name was Abram, and God changed his name to Abraham. And he was through him and through his son Isaac and Jacob, and of course, they were protected as a result of the descent of Jacob's son Joseph. And so we know that famous story. So now, again, everything was being orchestrated by God. Remember that, and of course, let me just stick a pause right there and just to bring it back to your remembrance, the famous statement that Joseph made to his brothers once they realized, what they had done and who Joseph really was. He made this statement. He said, you meant evil unto me, but God meant it for good, to save this people alive. And so, in other words, God was orchestrating everything that happened through the life of Joseph, even though his brothers did not realize it. But God had a plan, had this all mapped out and planned from the very beginning. Because if you recall earlier in Joseph's life, as a youngster, he had two dreams of his brothers basically bowing down to him, and which that, of course, is what angered them to the point where they wanted to kill him, and then eventually sold him into slavery, because that was kind of the last straw in their minds. So, but God had already was already orchestrating, and I'd already had his plan set and had everything in motion, and because he gave Joseph this dream which means that God had already had everything already planned out, and nothing was by accident, nothing was by arbitrary chance or random chance. So now, notice also, this is another very important thing that, and this is setting up the narrative for the book of Exodus too, by the way, that God had, not only was he orchestrating events in terms of peopling the nation, but God had already prepared a place. He had prepared a location in order for them to multiply and prosper. And the Bible says that this was referred to this place as the land of Goshen. The land of Goshen. And remember, Joseph was in place, and Joseph was the one responsible for placing them here in the land of Goshen. So why was that important? Well, notice this passage of scripture in Genesis 47 and 27. And it says in verse 27, so Israel dwelt in the land of Egypt, in the country of Goshen. And notice this, and they had possessions there, and grew and multiplied exceedingly. They grew and multiplied exceedingly. That was Genesis 47, verse 27. Now, here's a little imagery or chart dealing with the land of Goshen, because oftentimes we'll read a verse and we'll read a passage and we just kind of skip past it and really won't make the necessary mental connection as to why that was significant. Why did they grow, and why were they able to grow to such an exceeding amount there in the land of Goshen? What was significant about the land of Goshen? Well, if you look at this chart on the left, you can see that the Goshen was part of the Nile River Valley, and which if you notice here, you can see all these tributaries that branched off of the Nile River, and this was some of the most fertile plant. Remember a few several weeks ago, we did talk a little bit about what area that was referred to as the Fertile Crescent. It was like a half moon shaped landmass area that ran from the Euphrates River all the way to this part of the Nile, in Egypt, the Nile River, and that Fertile Crescent is often referred to as the quote unquote cradle of civilization. And the reason being is because it was full of fertile area, full of wherever you had a lot and significant and year-round water sources, is where most civilizations, early civilizations, would be able to thrive. And so in one of the most fertile areas of the entire Fertile Crescent was this area around Goshen, because of all of the different water tributaries. And when you have access to water like this, you have access to irrigation, you have access to year-round farming, you have access to where you can raise cattle. I mean, there was nothing basically you couldn't do in that civilization back then when you had this amount of access to water. So God had already prepared a place for them, and they prepared Joseph in order to see to it that they were settled in this particular place where they could now be peacefully grow and multiply. So now again, just as a summation. So that Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, God has peopling the nation. So as we proceed through and unpack the book of go into the book of Exodus, this is one last thing I wanted to point out as it pertains to Genesis, the first foundational book, that at the end of Genesis of Abraham's descendants, there were 75 people. Now, obviously, that's not nearly enough to have a nation, but these 75 people were settled in the land of Goshen, and around all that water, all that fertile land and fertile territory. Now, again, when Exodus opens 430 years later, and at that point, in that 430 years, from the closing of Genesis to the opening of Exodus, they had ballooned from 75 people to 2.5 million people. And the reason why we come up with that number is because as we get into the book of Numbers, we'll see that Moses did a census. And so that's kind of how we can approximate this number of 2.5 million people, which it could have actually been more than that, because the census did not include women and children. And so that's an important thing to keep in mind as well. So it was somewhere around, maybe more, 2.5 million people by the time Exodus opened. So in just 430 years, which in the overview of time itself is not like a crazy amount of time. Okay, but yeah, they had 2.5 million people that was congregated there in Goshen. Now, let's look at a basic outline of the book of Exodus. And we're just going to look at a basic outline. And we're going to just run through this basic outline because I want to get through this overview of Exodus. So when we come back next week, I want to be able to dive headlong into the law code and some of the more significant theological aspects of the book of Exodus that I really want to take some time to really dive into. So now, the book of Exodus tells the story of the amazing growth of Abraham's descendants. It tells of Israel's bondage in Egypt. The Israelites, despite their initial prosperity, are forced into harsh labor by a new Pharaoh who did not know Joseph and was fearful of their growing population. Moses' birth and miraculous preservation and a plot to kill all the newborn Hebrew males is enacted by this new Pharaoh. But Moses' mother saves him by hiding him and placing him in the Nile River, where he is found and adopted by Pharaoh's daughter. Now, think of that for being ironic. Okay, he's actually found it and adopted by the daughter of the Pharaoh who issued the decree in the first place. So how is that for irony? So Moses later kills an Egyptian and flees into Midian, where he marries and becomes a shepherd. Meanwhile, and by the way, Moses at that point in time, he lives in Midian as a shepherd amongst the Midianites for 40 years. For 40 years. So meanwhile, the Israelites cry out to God for deliverance from their suffering. God selected Moses to deliver Israel out of the land of Egypt at the burning bush. Pharaoh's refusing to let the Israelites go. And this is just a kind of a basic overview, a run through of the basic narrative of the first 18 chapters of the book of Exodus. And then, of course, we have the deliverance through the 10 plagues against the gods of Egypt. And I want you to keep that in mind. The plagues are against the gods of Egypt. That's very important to keep in mind. Israel's miraculous deliverance from Egyptian bondage, and that their journey to Mount Sinai and the Red Sea crossing, and Moses on Mount Sinai, and the Mosaic law is given, beginning again that second half. Remember, we talked about that the book of the book of Exodus is divided into two halves. And the second half is legislative, for God is teaching them, now that you're delivered, this is how I want you to live. This is what I want you to be able to do in order to live right, to live holy, to be separate, to be a separate nation unto me. The people's impatience, and of course their idolatry and the golden calf incident, and the re-giving of the law. After that incident, God, through Moses, gives the law again on Sinai. And then they begin the construction of the tabernacle and all of its furniture, which I might spend just 2 whole lessons on the tabernacle and all the corresponding furniture and ceremonies, because it was all a type of Christ. And that's one of the, in my opinion, that's one of the more fascinating studies in all of Scripture. And we're going to like stick a pin and do a little kind of a deeper dive into that study, the study of the tabernacle. And then Exodus 1 and 2, just kind of reviewing again, it recounts the early events of the Israelites' enslavement in Egypt and the birth of Moses. Now, here's something that's interesting. I've always found this really, really interesting. And it proves and demonstrates beyond a shadow of a doubt that none of these events were happening by random chance, but God was supernaturally and providentially at work orchestrating events. Notice what it says here in Exodus chapter 1, verses 7-8. And the children of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly. Notice Notice the language. Notice the verbs that are being. Notice the verbiage that's being used. And the children of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly and multiplied and waxed exceeding mighty, and the land was filled with them. Notice that. And there arose a new king over Egypt, which knew not Joseph. Now that's where the story really begins. The story of the deliverance really begins to really begin to unfold. Because prior to this, and think about this, and I need to stick another pin here, right there, just to point this out. Because imagine if this Pharaoh had never arose, and notice how prosperous they were. Notice that they were just exceedingly prosperous. They had everything that they could possibly imagine. They had everything they needed for their prosperity, for their growth. They had water, they had fertile land, they had everything. So imagine if this Pharaoh, and also, by the way, keep in mind that Egypt was not their promised land. God had another land in Canaan, which God had promised them. But imagine, just work with me here for a moment, and just imagine that had God not raised up that the Pharaoh who knew not Joseph and put them into bondage, what interest would they have had to leave all of that fertility, leave all of that good land, and just travel all in mass and go to the desert? The human nature would say that's not something we really want to do. So God had to create an environment which they would then beg to be delivered out of Egyptian bondage and taken, and so they can travel, so God can get them to their new land. So everything was being orchestrated for a specific purpose, and that's kind of what I wanted to point out. Now, here's another thing that I wanted to point out. It says the Israelites, despite their initial prosperity, are forced into harsh labor by a new Pharaoh who fears their growing population. Notice, and a plot to kill the newborn Hebrew males is enacted. But notice what happens. The king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives, of whom the name of Sephora and the name of the other was Pua. And get this. And he said, when you do the duties of a midwife for the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stools, if it be a son, then you shall kill him. But if it's a daughter, then she shall live. But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them to do, and they left the male children alive. Now notice, verse 18 says, so the king of Egypt called for the midwives and said to them, why have you done this thing and have saved the male children alive? And verse 19 says, and the midwife said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women, and this is so amazing right here, and I would imagine that many of you who have read this passage probably many times or heard of this passage many times, but never really thought about the connection of how God was providentially working in ways that does not even appear like right from the words of the text itself. But notice this. And the midwife said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are lively and give birth before the midwives even come to them. Now stop to think for a moment what that represents, because it says that the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, meaning the Egyptian women were soft. They weren't used to any hard labor. They weren't used to any kind of physical lifestyle. They most likely had a lot of servants waiting on them hand and foot. They didn't have to like do anything like strenuous, more than likely. But the Hebrew women, because you had placed them in hard bondage and hard labor, that kind of grizzled them, so to speak. And so they were able to physically give birth and just before the midwives ever even come to them, because they were stronger, they were probably more viral. And so it was just amazing to think about how God was actually working, even in the bondage situation, that God was still working because he had a bigger plan. There was a bigger picture that God was developing at the time. And part of their being in bondage was all a part of God's overall big plan. Because remember, Egypt was not their home. God had promised the land of Canaan to them, and so God had to create the environment in which they would want to go, and plus he also created the physical circumstances in which they would be able to prosper, continue to have many offspring, and also be in a position to want to be delivered out of that Egyptian bondage and go to the land which God had originally promised them. So again, all of this was part of God's working. All of this was part of his divine providential orchestration. And verse 20 says, therefore God dwelt with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very mighty. So imagine, in spite of the decree of Pharaoh, the people continued to multiply, and they continued to grow and be very mighty. So and so the whole concept that God was peopling the nation, you can see that everything was working the way God had intended it for it to work. So now let's look at Moses' birth and early life, just really quickly. At Moses' birth, his mother saved him by hiding him and placing him in the Nile River, where he is found and adopted by Pharaoh's daughter, which we kind of went over that and real quickly. But Moses later kills an Egyptian and flees to Midian, where he marries and becomes a shepherd and remains in Midian for the next 40 years. Now think about this too. This is another thing that's really amazing, because when Moses comes to deliver the people, he is now 80 years old. Think about that. So that's really amazing. So meanwhile, the Israelites cry out to God for deliverance from their suffering. God then commissions Moses from the burning bush on Mount Horeb. Now, Moses' commission at the burning bush. Notice this. God tells Moses that he has seen the suffering of his people in Egypt. And again, this is an overview of the narrative. The first 18, primarily the first 18 chapters. God declares his intention to deliver them from the Egyptians and bring them into the promised land. Keep that in mind. The promised land. Egypt is not their promised land. Moses is sent to Pharaoh to bring the Israelites out of Egypt. This was all at the burning bush. And after that, Moses said, who shall I say sent me? God reveals himself as I am that I am. Now, beginning in chapter 5, God continues his procedure of delivering Israel. And in delivering his people, God, through Moses, uses two pivotal events that God uses, or two really pivotal miracles, or series of miracles that God uses in order to deliver his people. The first is the 10 plagues, which we're going to talk about that here in a bit. And then finally, also the Red Sea crossing. Now, let's take a look just for instance at the 10 plagues. Now, the 10 plagues of Egypt, as described in the Bible, were a series of divine judgments sent by God to persuade Pharaoh to release the Israelites from slavery or from Egyptian bondage. Only the first three, and this is another thing that's really interesting too, by the way. Only the first three plagues affected the Israelites in Goshen. The first three affected the Israelites and the Egyptians alike, all the same. That's an important point to keep in mind, because God was trying to prove and demonstrate a point that he was trying to make, not only to the Egyptians and not only to Pharaoh, but also to the Hebrews at the same time. So now the remaining plagues did not. In other words, the first three plagues impacted everybody, even the Hebrews in Goshen. But then the subsequent 7 plagues only affected the Egyptians and had no effect on the Hebrews in Goshen. So God made a clear distinction. And also keep in mind that this would have been obvious to everyone. This would have been obvious to the Egyptians what was happening. It would have been obvious to them that the Hebrews were not being affected, because we got to remember, this was Moses. This was the God of gods. And so a clear distinction had to be made. and this would have been very, very obvious to the Hebrews, and also very obvious to the Egyptians. So the subsequent plagues affected only the Egyptians, showing a distinction between the Israelites and their captors, or more specifically, with a distinction between the Israelite God, singular, and big G, and the Egyptian gods, little g, plural. So that's very important. We want to keep that in mind. Now notice, each plague can be seen as a challenge to the power of specific Egyptian gods, demonstrating God's supremacy over them. Now, these were specific gods, and notice this verse. And as a matter of fact, Exodus chapter 12, verse 12, really summarizes this entire narrative of the plagues in general. For God says in Exodus chapter 12, verse 12, "For I will pass through the land of Egypt this night." And of course, this is the night of the when the firstborn were smitten. "And I will smite all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast." And notice this, very important. "And against all the gods of Egypt, against all the gods of Egypt, I will execute judgment. I am the Lord." So these weren't just random plagues. None of them were just random, just arbitrary plagues. God did not sit back and say, "I wonder what I'll do first. Maybe I'll turn the water into blood." No, these were specific plagues, specifically targeted at individual Egyptian gods. Because remember, the Egyptians were very heavily polytheistic, meaning they had a god for everything. So let's just take a look again. I have another chart here. You know, I'm big on showing charts and graphs. I want you to just look on the left column, and I won't take the time to go through this. If you like, you can take a screenshot of this, or you can just maybe go and research it on your own. But if you just look down the left column, you can see the 10 plagues: water turned to blood, the frogs, the lice, the flies, the disease on the cattle, the boils, hail, locusts, darkness, and of course the death of the firstborn. And then look in the middle column, and then it tells you, it shows the specific gods that the individual plague was specifically targeting. And so, for an example, the water being turned to blood specifically targeted Osiris, for example, who was the now was considered his bloodstream, or Hapi, which was the spirit of the now. And so we have these were specific gods, or little g's, that these plagues were targeting specifically, pointing to, in other words, God was letting the Egyptians know, as well as the Israelites, by the way, that he was more powerful than all of their gods put together. And it's an important note to keep in mind that although the text doesn't specifically tell us that in the book of Egypt, on the book of Exodus, because Moses doesn't specifically say, but it's without question that at least by the time you got to the second plague, probably by the first one, as a matter of fact, they would have all understood. There wouldn't have been no ambiguity at all whatsoever, that their specific God was being targeted. They would have known that, and it wouldn't have been no ifs, ands, or buts. They would have understood that. But Pharaoh's heart was hardened. But many of the people in his court, many of the other Egyptians, they also would have understood it, and they begged Pharaoh just to let the people go, because they understood that the God of the Hebrews was more powerful than all of their gods. So that was the message that God was sending. And if you look on the other side, on the right column, you can see that some of the first three of these plagues were duplicated by the Egyptians. Also occurs in Goshen, where the Israelites lived, and so forth. They were duplicated by the Egyptian again. But then from the flies on to the remainder, only impacted the Egyptians, did not impact any of the Hebrews. So another thing that's important, because they would have understood that too. The Egyptians would have saw that their gods were being attacked, but the Hebrews were being protected by the God of the Hebrews. So that would have been clear and obvious to everybody. Okay, it would have been no ifs, ands, or buts about it. So God was doing this, and he was sending a clear message that would have been, again, like I said, evident and obvious to everyone on the scene at the time. So then, of course, we get to the second miracle of deliverance. Now that they're delivered on the night of the death angel, the death of the firstborn, now we get to the Red Sea crossing, which is the second aspect or the second miracle that's involved in the deliverance from the Israelites from Egyptian bondage. So now you have people, now they needed a law. You got people, and the people is being delivered from Egypt. Now they needed their law code. They needed their legislation. They needed a constitution to know how to live now that they're set free from Egyptian bondage. Now, let's look at real quickly, and I want to, and I'm only got about another 5 to 7 minutes. The Red Sea crossing is a pivotal event from the book of Exodus, where God parted the Red Sea in order to allow the Israelites to escape from Egypt and the Pharaoh's pursuing army. And then he closed the waters on the Egyptians. Now, the importance of parting the Red Sea is that this one event was the final decisive act in God's delivering his people from slavery in Egypt. On the night of the 10th plague, the children of Israel left Egypt, and God led the people around the desert and the desert road toward the Red Sea. That's Exodus 13 and 18. And then also God told them where they camped. Notice he said, I will gain glory for myself. We told him to remain there. I will gain glory through myself, through Pharaoh and all his army, and the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord. Exodus 14 and 4. Now, the thing is interesting about this, that if the Egyptians don't already know, they're about to really get the final hammer dropped on them. There will be no questions about it at all whatsoever. Now, this is a way of saying that the Israelites were dedicated or initiated into Moses. And keep that in mind. That's another thing too I want to point out, because the the New Testament refers to the Red Sea crossing as a type of our deliverance from sin into Christianity, to salvation. In other words, in a similar way, Christians are baptized into Christ as we are initiated into him and obligated to him for our spiritual freedom. In other words, remember I mentioned earlier that the book of Exodus is loaded with a lot of theological significance, on example on top of example, most of which often goes unnoticed, or maybe unobserved or untaught, or maybe not considered, because we're big on the big dynamic scenes of the parting of the Red Sea and the plagues and so forth. However, there's so much spiritual New Testament referencing and significance as regards to the Red Sea crossing. Now, notice this is it. The Apostle Paul says this: I do not want you to be ignorant of the fact, brothers and sisters, that our ancestors were all under the cloud, and that they all passed through the sea. They were all, and by the way, let me just stop right there, because I didn't mention the fact that they were being led. They weren't just being randomly following or just randomly traveling through the desert, but they were literally being led through the desert by a pillar of a cloud. There was a cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. And so that was another important thing to keep in mind. We're going to unpack that more in detail as in the weeks coming. But they were all baptized into Moses. Notice the reference and the wording that Paul uses in the New Testament. They all passed through the sea. They were all baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. They all ate the same spiritual food and drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank from the spiritual rock that was accompanied that accompanied them, and that rock was Christ. This is Paul speaking in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 1 through 4. So notice the comparison and contrast that Paul is making here. So in parting the Red Sea, not only finalized God's redemption of his people from slavery in Egypt, but it also, and notice this, prefigured the greater spiritual reality of God's redemption of his people from slavery to sin through the work of Christ. Now, also, I want to stick a pin right here because it's important to make this connection that not only was God delivering his people from Egyptian bondage, but he was also establishing a pattern that we were going to follow. We're going to see this pattern throughout. Again, I'd say that there's so much theological significance and power and importance in the book of Exodus that oftentimes goes unnoticed. But we're going to unpack it in this study. And so we're going to see examples of just how significant the theological deepness and richness can be found in the book of Exodus, because what we see now, just in going through the Red Sea, it's just so much more than just the miracle itself, but there was also spiritual and theological significance in which God also was prefiguring the greater spiritual reality of God's redemption of his people from slavery to sin through the work of Christ. Now, it's important to keep in mind, in all fairness, to the early Hebrews in the part that went through the Red Sea, they had no idea. They had no clue, no idea, but what God was doing going forward. Not, at least not in totality. But we are able to look back, and we're able to understand exactly what God was doing and see the big picture framework that God was putting together. And we can understand now how all of these various puzzle pieces are all beginning to tie in and all beginning to fit together to form one big picture. And that big picture really began to form as we're going to see in the next coming weeks here in the book of Exodus. Now, therefore, the parting of the Red Sea is used in the New Testament, as Apostle Paul clearly pointed out, because he clearly identified going through the Red Sea with Christ. With baptism, he clearly made that clear distinction as a type, a symbol or a type of the believer's identification with the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. So that's a very, very important component. Now, also, let's take a look here. Now, here Paul gives, and I like this term, Paul gives the Exodus from Egypt a Christological reading. A Christological reading. Christology is a theological term, meaning the teachings about Christ that can be found all through scriptures from the Old Testament and the New. And one of the things we're going to find that's very interesting, but almost every book of the Old Testament, you're going to be able to see Jesus in every book, but especially in the book of Exodus. He's going to be from Exodus chapter 19 going forward. You're going to see Jesus, or let me just even rephrase, from the parting of the Red Sea to the end of the book, we're going to see Jesus over and over again. That's going to be very important as we go forward in this particular section. Now, by making the connection between the Exodus from Egypt and salvation in Christ, so that's what we mean by the Christological reading. By making that, by making the connection between the Exodus in Egypt and the salvation in Christ. That's kind of that's what is meant there by the connection of the Christological connection. That's exactly what's that's in reference to. Notice again how Paul says that all were baptized into Moses. So I'm kind of being a little bit redundant, but that's important that we make that connection, that we don't let that slip by. So because as this study is all about, it's all about the big picture of the Bible and how all of these other smaller components all are a part of the overall big picture. And then by understanding this big picture, understanding exactly what God was doing, then when you go back and study some of the individual isolated stories, you're going to be able to better and more successfully rather, rightly divide the word of truth, because we're going to understand the big picture and we're going to understand exactly the context of what God was actually doing. So now, let's look a little bit about the time spent at Mount Sinai. And of course, too, we're going to be able to see why an example here of the 11 foundational books, and how we're going to see the one book that's not a foundational book, that's out of sequence, but it also supplements the book of Exodus. So let's we're going to see that here in a moment. Now, after the Exodus, the Israelites camped at Mount Sinai for approximately 11 months and 5 days. 11 months and 5 days. So how do we know that? Because we're told in the book of Numbers, chapter 10, verses 11 through 12, and it came to pass on the 20th day of the second month in the second year, that the cloud was taken up from off the tabernacle of the testimony, and the children of Israel took their journeys out of the wilderness of Sinai, and the cloud rested in the wilderness of Paran. So now, basically in a nutshell, they arrived in the wilderness of Sinai in the third month after leaving Egypt, and departed the second month of the following year, which means they were there for just under 1 year, for 11 months and 5 days to be exact. Now, during this time, 3 key things happened in this 11-month time, and this is interesting, because we need to understand, the time frame and the time stamp and all what was going on, and why we're using these 11 foundational books to tell the big picture story. Because now here, if you just take a pause right here, it is when they were there during the time that they were camped at Sinai in the book of Exodus, that it is there that the book of Leviticus is given. So the book of Leviticus is given while they were camped at Sinai during this 11 months and 5 day time span. So part of that time was spent. They received the book of Leviticus. So when you go in and study Leviticus, you understand that Leviticus was part of the law that was given to Moses. And so, in other words, we're going to see here in a moment that the law that was given to Moses was much more than just the 10 commandments. So obviously it would not have taken nearly a year just to give the 10 commandments. So there was a lot more happening, a lot more taking place, a lot more that God was giving them and teaching them. So now during this 11 months and 5 day period that they were camped at Sinai in the book of Exodus, during this time, 3 key things happened. First of all, they received the law. They received their law code, which again, we're going to see here that the law was much more than just the 10 commandments. Secondly, they received instructions for the building of the tabernacle. The instructions for the building of the tabernacle. And that's where we're going to pick up next time. We're going to really unpack the building of the tabernacle, because there's so much rich typology and rich theology and rich Christology as we get into the tabernacle, because every aspect of it, every single solitary aspect of the tabernacle was pointing in one way or another toward the Jesus who was to come. Now, and the third thing that happened is that they got organized by tribe. They got organized by tribe. So they received the law in this 11-month or just under a year time frame. They received the law. They received instructions for building the tabernacle, and they got organized by tribe. So what do we mean when we say they got organized by tribe? Well, if you look at this chart, and here again, it's me showing charts and graphs, because I love my visual aids. Notice that when the construction of the tabernacle was completed, notice the arrangement of the camp, the organization of the camp. And this was the precise organization that Israel marched in, that they camped in, precisely in this manner, exactly. And of course, you can also see this number that you see around each tribe: Dan 62,700 and so forth, and Asher 41,500. This was a number that came as a result of the census that was given in the book of Numbers. And also keep in mind that this census only included males who were fighting age. So this was males over the age of 18. So it didn't include anybody under 18, and it did not include women, and did not include the elderly. So that's how we get that approximation of 2.5 million people by the time Exodus opened. So now, with that being said, also now this is how they were camped. The encampment of the tribes of Israel this is the organizational chart, the organizational camp. But then when it became time for them to march out, to move forward, to travel, then this is the sequence in which they would travel. And this was the exact sequence that in which they encamped. If you notice how they were encamped, and then they would travel, and they would out the same way. In other words, if you can see over here on the left side, Judah, Issachar, and Benjamin, they would always lead out. So as they were traveling, they were Judah, Issachar, and Zebulon. This was the sequence. This was the format in which they got organized, and it also demonstrates so many other things. It demonstrates how God is a God of order. God is a God of structure, God of order. And this is a prime example. We're going to get into this more a little bit later going forward, because I think this is very significant. Now, the giving of the law, the second building of the block to form a nation, the law given at Mount Sinai had 3 separate components to it. And then I'm almost done for tonight, but it had 3 separate components to it. Again, remember I said earlier that many people surmise when you think of giving a law, the first thing that comes to mind is the 10 Commandments. Well, the law, as we're going to discover, was much, much more than just the 10 Commandments. Now, the law was given, you had 3 separate components: the moral laws, which was the 10 Commandments. Then you had the civil laws, which you kind of like civil government and civil laws, which we're going to talk about. And then you also had ceremonial laws. This is where we're going to spend the majority of our time in the next couple of weeks, talking about the ceremonies, the ceremonial laws, because this centered around the tabernacle and its furnishings, and all the different sacrifices and offerings, and all the different ceremonies and feasts that God commanded that they observe going forward. All of this was a part of the law. And as a matter of fact, most of the ceremonial laws, for an example, was comprised of the book of Leviticus. And so again, which was given during this nearly a 1-year period while they were encamped at Mount Sinai. So now let's take a quick look at their moral law code, which was the 10 Commandments. The first 5 commandments were about man's relationship to God. And this is just some brief summary information. The first 5 commandments were about man's relationship to God. And then the second, or the last 5, involved man's relationship to each other. Another important component to keep in mind. Now, so let's just take a look. So the 10 commandments was do not worship other gods. Remember, the first 5 God's command were about God's or man's relationship to God. Do not worship other gods. Do not worship idols. Do not take the Lord's name in vain. Keep the Sabbath holy. And honor your father and your mother. And then the last 5 involved man's relationship to each other. And notice this: do not commit murder. Do not commit adultery. Do not steal. Do not bear false witness. And finally, do not covet. So again, we're looking at what our responsibility is to each other. So now, then we had a series of civil laws. The civil laws were like, you had slavery laws, for an example, in Exodus 21, verses 1 through 11. You had personal injury laws, chapter 21, verses 12 through 36. You had property laws, verses 1 through 15, chapter 22. You had laws concerning immorality and other similar issues. You had laws concerning civil obligations. All of this was a part of the law, and this is some of the things that really gets ignored when you talk about when the subject of the law comes up. Now, laws concerning conquest, and then of course you had the ceremonial laws, and then also let me just stick another pin right there real quick. because understanding these various laws and various aspects of the law is important that we keep in mind, because oftentimes when you get in the New Testament, the argument always comes up is that, quote unquote, we're no longer under the law. But a lot of times, or most people that say that, they don't have a real concept of what they're saying, because they don't have a concept of what the law was all about. As a general rule, we're still, like for example, the 10 Commandments are still pertinent today, or the last 5 in particular. Matter of fact, all 10 are relevant as of today. But now let's go forward. But then now what happens is, when you're talking about we're no longer under the law, is primarily referencing the ceremonial laws. The ceremonial laws, which we were talking about, with regarding the various feasts and ceremonies and sacrifice. The reason why we're not under that, because these ceremonies, each one, all pointed to, or were a type of Christ who was to come. And Christ, when he came, he was the fulfillment of all of these various ceremonies, because they all pointed to him. So now, I'm going to get into that more into detail later too, by the way. And the ceremonial laws primarily involved, or centered around, to be more specific, centered around the construction of the tabernacle, which was Israel's portable worship center. And that's beginning Exodus 25. Now, if you can look here, this is kind of an artist rendition of the tabernacle during the day. And remember the other organizational chart that we showed earlier. And as you can see, if you were back in that day and you were up on one of these hills looking down into the valley, and you've seen this structure and this organizational chart, or this organization of these people in these tents, and you would have been fascinated when you saw the cloud, and the cloud turned into fire by night. It would have been a sight to behold, especially if you were a stranger observing this on top of one of the hilltops. Notice too also that in the evening, that pillar of fire would turn, the pillar of cloud would turn to fire at night, which would have just been incredibly amazing to witness. And now, of course, involving and centered around tabernacle worship, you had 7 feasts of the Lord. And the 7 feasts are the Passover feast, which of course was a commemoration to how God delivered them from Egypt on the night of the Passover. Then you had the Feast of Unleavened Bread. You had the Feast of First Fruits. You had the Feast of Pentecost. And you had the Feast of Trumpets. And you also had the Day of Atonement and the Feast of Tabernacles. The Feast of Tabernacles. All of these, again, in one way or another, pointed to a Messiah that was to come. Then you have 5 types of sacrifices and offerings that Israel made, all of which were made at the tabernacle. You had the burnt offerings. You had the grain offerings. You had the peace offering. And all of this, is the description is given in the book of Leviticus, by the way. The sin offering, and all, by the way, all while they were in that nearly a year time frame at Mount Sinai, where they was receiving all of this. So that's the reason why Leviticus would not be a foundational book, but it's a supplemental book, because Leviticus supplement the book of Exodus. So that's an important distinction to make, and that kind of will help you to understand where we're going and where we're headed, and why we've chosen just to focus primarily on these 11 foundational books, and then just kind of draw attention to one of these supplemental books as we go forward now. And then finally, we had the trespass offering. All of these offerings, these were the 5 offerings that God commanded that they would give for various different times, for various different reasons that we'll talk about in future weeks. Now, and if you can look here, this was like inside the tabernacle, and this first article, piece of item here, where they're burning the sacrifice, is known as the brazen altar. And then, of course, then you had we're going to look at it in more detail later. But of course, you had the tabernacle structure where this curtain is, where only the priests were allowed to enter, and there was a very, very precise procedure that they had to follow. And so all of this, by the way, again, as we're going to learn going forward, was a type of Jesus Christ. And Jesus fulfilled in every way, shape, and form that these offerings and these sacrifices represented. Now, that is what I'm done for today, and that's all we're going to deal with today. That was just went a little longer than I intended, but I just wanted to get that basic summary of the book of Exodus out of the way, because I wanted to come back next week and just dive headlong into the second part of that narrative, which is the giving of the law, and primarily I want to focus on the construction and the significance of the tabernacle and all the various furniture and all of the corresponding ceremonies and offerings that were associated with the giving of the tabernacle. But in the meantime, for those of you who might be interested, if you want to dive deeper and just be able to track with me where we're going, I have on my website, bruceloganministries.com, you click on the store and I have a PDF download study guide. It's 135 pages and it's for $14.95. And it's not a hard copy. It's a PDF download. And the reason why I think that's insignificant to do it in form of a download, because if you're a Sunday school teacher, if you're a small group teacher, or if you're a pastor, want to do a sermon series, you can click on certain pages and certain areas of the study or the study guide. You can make copies, you can print out copies and so forth, or you can print out handouts. And there's so many things you can do, so many advantages of just doing a PDF type of study guide like this. And so you can go and you can download it on my website, bruceloganministries.com. And remember, this is not a hard copy, it's just a PDF download. And so that'll be great help. Or you can create other PowerPoints. And also many of the charts and graphs and images that we use in this presentation can be found, by the way, in that study guide. So for those of you that might be interested, I would encourage you to go and take a look at that. And then finally, I just want to point out, as per my custom, especially for those of you who are joining me for the first time, one of my favorite passages of scripture in all of the New Testament is Acts 17 and 11. And I've adopted, I've kind of let me just say adopted Acts 17 and 11 as my trademark premise of everything that I do in this ministry. Because what I mean by that is I don't want you taking my word for anything. I want you to be able to do what the Bereans did. And that's my whole really desire in doing this ministry, is that I desire to create a community of Bereans who are not going to believe anything or accept at face value anything that I say, but are going to be, I'll say enough that you will be motivated and encouraged to want to go back and research and study for yourself to see if there's anything that I said or the thing that I'm saying is accurate or not. And notice what it says in Acts 17 and 11. It says, "Now the Berean Jews were of more noble character than those in Thessalonica, for they received the message with great eagerness, and examined the scripture every day to see if what Paul said was true." So in that verse, you guys see two very significant things that we can see from there. From that verse, it says, first of all, they had a hunger. They received the word, they received Paul's teaching with great eagerness, meaning they had a hunger, a desire, a yearning to want to learn the scriptures. And also, well, you see three things actually, because when it says they examine the scriptures every day, that the New Testament at this particular moment was not a thing yet. The New Testament was not written. So when it says, when we read in the New Testament that they search the scriptures, this is prime, especially in the book of Acts. This is primarily that what they were referring to is that all they had was the Old Testament. All they had was the Old Testament. So Paul was teaching them from the Old Testament. And so they were intrigued enough that they wanted to go home every day and research for themselves to see whether or not what Paul was saying was true. And then also the final thing that I want to point out about this particular verse is that they had the Apostle Paul teaching them, which the argument can be made that outside of Jesus Christ himself, that Paul was the greatest teacher, greatest theologian that ever lived. And even though they had the Apostle Paul teaching them, they still had to go and see what Paul, or research for themselves to see if what Paul was saying was actually in the Bible actually accurate or not. And so if they had to do that for Paul, then most certainly, the Bruce Logans of the world can't uh, uh, resemble Paul in any way, shape, or form. And so obviously if the Bereans wanted to go back and really check Paul, then I'm encouraging everybody to do the same and do likewise and check everything that I say. And you can feel free to leave a comment or send me a text or send me a message me or write comments in the comment section. And if you have any question, issues, or disagreements in any way, shape, or form, all I ask is that you be respectful, and then I'll try to actually address those as they come through. And so last but not least, of course, I want you to just be reminded that if you really like what we're doing here and the things that we're teaching and sharing, please share these lessons with your Facebook or your YouTube community or your social media community, and just ask that you maybe click the bell, subscribe to this channel, because obviously, I'm sure you all know, this kind of helps the algorithms rather, and then that will be a great benefit and a great help to everything that we're doing here in this ministry. So we're going to go back. So if you give me a moment, I'm going to go back to my home studio. And from here, we're going to close out today. And I'm asked that everybody join us next week, because beginning next week, we're going to take a very deep dive into the tabernacle and the giving of the law, the second building block of a nation. And so I'm looking forward to being back next week, and hopefully you all will be able to join me and maybe share this with other people, so they would come in and maybe hopefully will enjoy the things that we're sharing here in this study. Until next week, may God bless each and every one of you, and we'll see you again next Monday night.